The millionaire saw his cook teaching his son to dance, but when he found out the real reason, he broke out in a cold sweat. Julian Lombardi was not a man who paid attention to everyday details. Everything in his life worked with mathematical precision: his business, his house, his daily routine. There was no room for surprises. Therefore, as he walked down the corridor to his office, what he saw through the window completely puzzled him. His son danced, but he was not alone. There was a cook with him. The scene was so unusual that he had to blink several times to make sure he wasn't imagining it. Leonardo, his 12-year-old son, followed the woman's steps awkwardly, but with unusual concentration. His movements were uncertain, but there was something about him that Julian hadn't seen in years: a smile. Lyra, a woman with dark hair tied up in a braid and in an impeccable uniform, moved smoothly on the grass. It was not just a game, not a passing joke. She knew what she was doing. Every movement was precise, delicate, full of technique. She moved not like someone dancing for fun, but like someone who had done it all her life. Julian frowned. It didn't make sense. His son has never shown interest in dancing. He was always an introverted, serious boy, more interested in books and technology than in any physical activity. Why was he doing it now? And why with her? Julian watched silently from the shadow of the corridor. The cook gently took Leonardo's hands and showed him a step. The boy frowned, concentrating, and tried to repeat. He couldn't handle it, but instead of getting upset, he laughed. Julian felt a slight lump in his stomach. He didn't remember the last time he had seen his son laugh so naturally. Ever since his mother died, Leonardo seemed extinguished, always closed in his world, always with an expression of melancholy on his face. But now he seemed like a child again. And it was thanks to her. Julian felt chills. He did not like that someone else had such an influence on his son, especially a simple cook. His irritation grew for no apparent reason. He couldn't stay there without interfering. So he went out into the garden. The sound of his footsteps echoed along the stone path. Instantly Leonardo and the cook stopped. The boy lowered his head as if he had been caught doing something illegal. The cook slowly straightened up, showing no fear, but with a certain restraint in her eyes. Julian analyzed it. He knew her only superficially. Knew her name, Isabella, knew she had been working in the house for 6 months, knew she was doing her job well and was not causing problems. But I've never seen her like now. What's going on here? He asked coldly. Isabella wiped her hands on her apron. We were just practicing, Senor. Julian looked at his son. Since when have you been interested in dancing? Leonardo lowered his head. For a long time. Julian felt a pang of guilt. He never noticed it because he never bothered to ask. Why didn't you say anything? Leonardo shrugged. Before he could answer, Isabella intervened. Because he had no one to practice with. Julian looked at her. What do you know about dancing? For the first time he saw a doubt in her expression, a moment of hesitation, as if she did not want to answer. At last she sighed. Enough. Julian gritted his teeth. There was something strange about this woman, something that did not fit into the image of a simple cook. It's not your responsibility to teach my son. Isabella held his gaze firmly. No, it is not. Then why are you doing this? She crossed her arms over her chest. Because he asked me. Julian turned to Leonardo. Is it true? The boy nodded silently. The millionaire sighed in irritation. He didn't know why, but it bothered him more than usual. Something in the way the cook behaved, something in the way his son looked at her. At last he looked hard at Isabella. I want to talk to you alone. She didn't blink. As you wish, Senor. Julian returned to the house, but before he entered, he looked over his shoulder and saw something that made his stomach turn upside down. Isabella leaned over to Leonardo, said something to him in a low voice, and the boy smiled conspiratorially, as if they had a secret, as if she knew something that he did not know. Julian froze in place. His instinct was that there was more, much more to the story, and he was determined to find out. Already in his office, Julian passed his hand over his face. Something didn't add up. Isabella was not just a cook. His son didn't just learn to dance. And there was something between them that he did not understand. But he was sure of one thing: he wasn't going to sit idly by. Because when it came to his son, he wouldn't let anyone else take his place. Julian sat down at the dinner table, as he does every evening. A long table made of dark wood shone flawlessly under the light of a huge chandelier. The cutlery was perfectly aligned, and the aroma of freshly cooked food filled the air. Everything was exactly the same as always, except for one thing. Leonardo did not sit with an absent gaze, staring at his plate. He didn't play with food, he didn't look bored. He was restless, his eyes shining, as if he was waiting for dinner to end as soon as possible. Julian did not miss this detail. "Why such a hurry?" he asked, putting a piece in his mouth. Leonardo quickly raised his head. "I don't have a rush." But it was there. It was obvious. The boy could not sit still. Every few seconds he looked at the door as if he were waiting for someone. Julian watched his every move. He knew exactly who he was waiting for, and he didn't like it. "Are you going to continue practicing after dinner?" he asked in a casual tone. Leonardo paused, surprised. "Yes, if you don't mind." Julian put his fork on the table. "Since when have you been interested in dancing?" The boy looked away. "For a long time." "Why didn't you ever mention it?" Leonardo shrugged. "I didn't think it was important to you." Julian frowned. "Of course, it's important to me." Leonardo looked at him directly. "Really?" The question hit him like a slap in the face. For a moment, he didn't know what to say because the truth was that he had no idea what was important to his son. He never bothered to ask. Julian went to his office and closed the door. His thoughts did not stop working. Leonardo had never shown such enthusiasm for anything, especially for such an unexpected activity as dancing. What bothered him most was not that his son was dancing, but that he was doing it with a cook. What was there in her that he did not have? How did she manage to gain Leonardo's trust in such a short time? Why did his son open up more to a stranger than to his own father? Julian gritted his teeth. He couldn't ignore it. There was something else to this story, and he had to find out. The millionaire sat down in front of his computer. If the cook was hiding something, he would discover it. He searched her name in the staff files. Isabella Ruiz, 29, hired 6 months ago, with no criminal record, no disturbing records. Nothing strange. Too normal, and he didn't like it. He decided to look for her name on the internet. I typed Isabella Ruiz the dancer. The first search yielded nothing, but in the second he did. An article from 7 years ago: a young ballet star disappears from the stage without explanation. Julian leaned over the screen. He opened the news, and what he read made him feel cold. Article told about a dancer prodigy, a woman with undeniable talent, who shone on every stage and had a brilliant future in dance until one day she disappeared. There were no scandals, no accidents, she just stopped dancing, and no one knew why. Julian fell silent. Now he had even more questions. Why does a dancer with such talent end up working as a cook in his house? What made her quit everything? And most importantly, why is she so interested in his son? Julian stood up abruptly. He couldn't ignore it anymore. He needed answers. He left his office and went down to the kitchen. He found her putting away the kitchen utensils. Seeing him, she didn't look surprised, as if she expected him to appear at some point. "Signor Lombardi?" Julian closed the door behind him. "We need to talk." Isabella wiped her hands with a towel. "About your son, I suppose?" Julian did not waste time. "You're not just a cook." For the first time he saw something in her expression, something like guilt. "What do you mean?" she asked. Julian put his phone on the table. There was an article on the screen about her disappearance from the ballet. Isabella froze. She didn't say anything, but her eyes said everything. She knew she couldn't hide it anymore. Julian crossed his arms over his chest. "Tell me the truth. Now." Isabella closed her eyes for a second, and when she opened them, her gaze was different. "You have no idea what you are asking, Signor Lombardi." Julian took a step toward her. "Explain to me." She exhaled slowly. "If I tell you the truth, everything will change." Julian did not look away. "Then tell me." Isabella watched him silently, and after a long moment she opened her mouth to speak. The air in the kitchen was dense, filled with silent tension. Julian did not take his eyes off Isabella. She still had her hands on the table, staring at his phone screen. The photo showed her face a few years ago, younger, in a white ballerina dress, smiling on a big stage. Julian knew that she could no longer evade it. "Why did you give up everything?" he asked quietly but firmly. Isabella closed her eyes for a moment. "It's not as easy as you think, Signor Lombardi." Julian crossed his arms over his chest. "Keep it simple." Isabella sighed. "Because I lost everything." For the first time, Isabella lowered her defense. Her eyes showed a glimmer of sadness. "When I was 22, my life revolved around dance. That was all I had, everything I knew." She paused, as if the words were hard to pronounce. "I had a fiancé, Andres. He was also a dancer. We were the perfect couple, or so we thought." Julian noticed how her hands tensed on the table. "We were hired for an international tour. It was the opportunity of a lifetime." She fell silent for a moment, her gaze distant, as if she was going through something she had never been able to overcome. "But the day before our most important performance, he had an accident." Julian frowned. "What accident?" Isabella pursed her lips. "He was hit by a car. He died on the spot." Julian did not know what to say. The pain in her voice was real. Isabella smiled bitterly. "After that, everything changed. I couldn't dance without him. I couldn't hear the music without feeling that something was missing." Her eyes moistened for a moment, but she didn't let the tears fall. "I left the stage. I've distanced myself from everything." Julian took a deep breath. For the first time, he realized that the woman in front of him was not just a cook. This was someone who had to rebuild himself from scratch. Isabella looked puzzled. "Why teach my son?" She paused. "Because he reminds me of me when I was his age." Julian tensed. "What do you mean?" Isabella stared at him. "He doesn't smile, Signor Lombardi." Julian felt a pang in his chest. "He's smiling." Isabella shook her head. "Not like when he dances." The millionaire gritted his teeth. "Do you think I don't know what my son needs?" She did not back down. "I think he needed someone to listen to him." The silence became overwhelming because deep down Julian knew she was right. Julian ran his hand through his hair. "And what are you going to do? Make him dance like that would solve all the problems?" Isabella sighed. "It's not just about the dance. It's about giving him something that will make him feel alive again." Julian stared at the table. His thoughts were in chaos. He always believed that he was giving his son everything he needed: a huge home, a first-class education, amenities that other children could only dream of. But he never stopped to ask what he really wanted. And now the stranger, a simple cook, knew more about his son than he did. When Julian returned to his room, he found Leonardo still awake. The boy sat on the bed, looking out the window. "Isn't it too late for sleep?" his father asked, leaning against the doorframe. Leonardo didn't look at him. "Are you going to fire her?" Julian frowned. "Why do you think so?" Leonardo shrugged. It always annoys you when someone interferes in my life. The comment hurt him more than he expected. He slowly walked over and sat down on the edge of the bed. Do you like dancing? Leonardo nodded. Julian exhaled slowly. You never told me. You never asked. Julian fell silent because his son was right. That night, Julian could not sleep. He lay staring up at the ceiling, thinking about everything, Isabella, his son, what it all meant, and the possibility that for the first time in years he was the one who was wrong. The next morning, he made a decision. He went down to the kitchen before anyone else. Isabella was preparing breakfast. When she saw him come in, she stopped, waiting for him to speak. And then Julian said something that she did not expect. I don't want you to stop teaching him. Isabella blinked. Excuse me? My son has never been so happy. And if dancing makes him happy, then I want him to continue. For the first time, Isabella smiled, and at that moment Julian realized that this story was just beginning. The morning began like any other. Julian went down to the kitchen early, expecting to find Isabella serving breakfast as usual. But this time something was different. The kitchen was no longer just a workplace. It turned into a refuge, a space where his son smiled, where he found something that was still missing in his life. And the worst thing was that it wasn't because of him. This happened thanks to her. Julian gritted his teeth. He still had a hard time accepting what he had decided. Allowing Isabella to continue teaching Leonardo to dance was not easy, and now that he saw her laughing quietly with his son, he couldn't help but feel repressed. It was as if she was filling a place that belonged to him, as if his son was creating a bond with her that he had never had. Would you like coffee, Signor Lombardi? Asked Isabella in her usual tone. Julian tensed for a moment. No, thank you. She nodded and continued to prepare breakfast. Leonardo, sitting at the table, ate with enthusiasm, not with the usual apathy, not with the usual indifference. He was excited because he would have another lesson with her afterward. Julian took a sip of water, trying to ignore the feeling of discomfort. What time do you start today? He asked. Leonardo looked up. At 4 o'clock. Julian crossed his arms over his chest. Don't forget about studying. Leonardo nodded quickly, not even worried. I know. It was strange. Julian never had to be reminded of anything. His son was always organized, responsible, and accurate. But now he seemed to be in a hurry to end the day, to go out into the garden, to dance, to be with her. And this bothered Julian more than he was willing to admit. Julian locked himself in his office, but his thoughts were still in the kitchen. He couldn't concentrate, he couldn't ignore the way his son had behaved lately, much less ignore what Isabella now represented in his home. He decided to go out to get some air. As he walked through the corridors, he saw her. Isabella was in the backyard, taking a break. For a moment, Julian hesitated. He could have just walked by, he could have ignored it, but he didn't. He went out into the garden and walked slowly. She noticed his presence, but did not flinch. Signor Lombardi? Julian crossed his arms over his chest. Do you have a minute? She looked at him cautiously. Of course. Julian sat down on a stone bench opposite her. The sun shone on the grass, and the morning breeze gently stirred the leaves of the trees, but inside Julian did not feel peace. Why does my son trust you so much? Isabella was surprised by the question. What do you mean? Since my wife died, Leonardo has never opened up to anyone. Not to my teachers, not to my psychologist, not even to me. Isabella looked down. Sometimes it's easier to talk to strangers. Julian grinned ironically. You're not a stranger to him. No, she looked up, but I'm not his father either. The words fell like a stone, because it was true. No matter how hard he tried, Leonardo found something in her that he had never found in him. Julian took a deep breath. I don't want you to think that I don't appreciate what you do for him. Isabella looked at him curiously. But? Julian frowned. But I don't want you to distance him from me. Isabella was silent for a moment, seeming to choose her words very carefully. Signor Lombardi, I cannot distance him from you. Julian tensed. What do you mean? She looked at him seriously. That if Leonardo doesn't get close to you, it's not because of me. The words hit him harder than he expected, because he knew they were true. Julian stared at the ground. He had never been a person who doubted himself, but now he did. He tried to say something, but the words got stuck in his throat. Signor Lombardi, interrupted Isabella in a calm voice, Leonardo admires you. Julian quickly looked up. Do you really think so? She smiled slightly. Yes. But he is afraid. Julian froze. Afraid of what? Disappoint you. Julian fell silent. He had thought so many times that his son saw him as a cold, distant person, but it never occurred to him that he saw him as someone he didn't want to let down. And it completely changed his perspective. Later that day, Julian found Leonardo in his room. The boy was sitting on the floor, tying his dancing shoes. Julian stopped in the doorway. For a moment, he froze. He was never a father who talked about feelings. But this time he decided to give it a try. Son? Leonardo looked up. Yes? Julian inhaled slowly. I just want you to know that if that's what you really want to do, you don't have to hide it. Leonardo looked at him in surprise. Really? Julian nodded. Yes. And I don't want you to be afraid of disappointing me. The boy lowered his head. I don't want you to think him smaller. Julian knelt before him. Leonardo, you are my son and I am proud of you, no matter what you do. Leonardo's eyes were filled with emotion. For the first time in a long time, he felt understood. And for the first time in a long time, Julian felt that he was doing something right as a father. The sun barely appeared through the windows of the Lombardi mansion, painting everything with a golden light. In the kitchen, the sound of cutlery, plates, and coffee pouring marked the beginning of a day that would have been ordinary for someone else, but not for Julian Lombardi. Not after what had happened since he had spoken to Leonardo the night before. Something had changed inside him. For the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to be a father, and for the first time in a long time, his son looked at him with real confidence. He still didn't know exactly how to handle all of this, but he knew he didn't want to distance himself from him again. Therefore, today he will do something different. Today he will go to see how he dances. From his office, Julian heard music playing in the backyard. He got up from his chair, feeling something he didn't quite understand. Curiosity? Waiting? Maybe even pride? He walked quietly through the corridors until he came to a glass door leading to the garden. He stopped just before crossing it, looking through the glass, and what he saw left him speechless. Leonardo moved with a smoothness that he had never seen in him before. His steps were soft but confident. Every movement was precise, devoted, passionate. He was not the same clumsy and introverted boy as a few days ago. It was his son, a boy, who found something that really made him happy. And in the midst of it all, Isabella stood watching him, patiently correcting every step. Julian clenched his fists, not because he was upset, but because he knew he could no longer ignore the truth. She had changed his son's life, and although it was hard for him to admit it, he owed her something too. Julian waited until the end of the rehearsal. When he saw that Leonardo had gone to change clothes, he decided that this was the perfect moment. He walked over to Isabella, who was packing her bag. She turned, sensing his presence, without a trace of surprise, as if she had expected him to come. Signor Lombardi, she greeted in her calm voice. Julian crossed his arms over his chest. I want to thank you. Isabella frowned slightly. For what? Julian sighed. For what you did for my son. Isabella smiled slightly. I didn't do anything special. I just listened to him. Julian looked away. That's more than I've done in years. A heavy silence fell. Isabella seemed to want to say something else, and after a moment she did. "If I may ask, why is it so difficult for you to see him happy?" Julian tensed. "What do you mean? You always seem to be looking for something bad about what makes him happy." Julian pursed his lips. He knew she was right, but he couldn't admit it. Not yet. Julian returned to his office with whirling thoughts. Why is it so difficult for him to accept this? Why did he feel like he was losing something? And then he understood. It wasn't that Isabella was taking his son away from him. The fact was that Leonardo found in her what he could never find in him, a figure of support, someone who understood him. And it hurt because it made him realize all his mistakes, all the time he lost. And now he did not know whether he would have time to fix everything. Julian forced himself to leave the office when the dance lesson began again. But this time he did not stand aside. This time he came closer, walked to the garden, and sat down on a stone bench from which he could see everything. Leonardo noticed his presence and stopped. He froze for a moment. His father had never seen him dance up close, and it made him nervous. Julian noticed this. So he did something he had never done before, smiling and nodding as a sign that he was still here, as a sign that he wouldn't judge him this time. Leonardo took a deep breath and continued to dance. And while he was doing this, Julian felt something strange in his chest. For the first time in years, he felt proud of his son. Not for what he did, not for how talented he was, but for having the courage to follow his passion no matter what. And it was something he had never seen in it before. Later that evening, Julian was in the reading room when Leonardo walked in. The boy seemed nervous. Julian closed the book he was holding in his hands. "Is something wrong?" Leonardo hesitated for a moment and then spoke. "Dad, will you let me participate in the competition?" Julian blinked. "In a competition?" Leonardo nodded. "In the dance tournament." Julian's heart beat faster. Not because he was against it, but because it was no longer just a hobby. It was real. Leonardo was ready to take his love of dancing to the next level. And now the question was whether Julian was ready to accept it. Julian was silent after hearing his son's question. Participate in a dance tournament. Leonardo waited for his answer with eyes full of emotion, but also with a dose of fear. He knew that his father could say no, that he could stop everything with a single word, that he could turn that dream into a mere fleeting whim. But Julian did not say anything at once. He only sighed and closed his eyes for a moment. He knew that this moment would come. He knew that if he allowed his son to continue dancing, at some point he would want more. And now that moment has come. At last he opened his eyes and spoke. "Tell me more about the competition." Leonardo blinked, surprised. "Does that mean yes?" Julian crossed his arms over his chest. "That means I want to understand." Leonardo held his breath for a second, and then began to explain everything with a beaming smile. Julian knew that he could not make this decision alone, so after talking to Leonardo, he went to look for Isabella. He found her in the kitchen, cleaning up ingredients after dinner. Seeing him enter, she didn't look surprised. "I knew you were coming to look for me," she said calmly. Julian raised an eyebrow. "And why?" "Because I know what your son asked you for." Julian leaned on the counter and crossed his arms. "What do you think about it?" Isabella sighed slightly. "I think it's his dream and it would be a mistake to say no to him." Julian did not take his eyes off her. "What if he fails?" Isabella looked at him seriously. "And if not?" Silence filled the kitchen. Julian knew that Isabella was right, but there was still something that bothered him. "Why is it so important to you?" Isabella paused, then said in a softer tone, "Because I wanted to compete when I was his age, too. And no one supported me." Julian tensed. "Your family didn't support you?" She smiled sadly. "They told me that it wasn't a real career, that it was a hobby, that I shouldn't waste time on something that wouldn't give me stability." Isabella looked down for a moment. So I was forced to give it up. Julian froze in place. For the first time, he understood why Isabella was so persistent with Leonardo. Not only because I saw his talent, but also because I saw my reflection in him. Julian sat in his office with dim lights and accelerated thinking. He had to make a decision. He couldn't just let his son participate in the competition without thinking about the consequences. He knew what the real world was like, he knew how cruel it could be, he knew that not all dreams come true. And above all, he knew what failure was, because he himself had failed at many things. He had failed in marriage, failed as a husband, and still felt that he had failed as a father. What if Leonardo participates in the competition? What if he encourages him to pursue this dream? And what if he fails too? Will he be able to withstand it? Will he be able to see his son suffering from a disappointment that he himself could have prevented? Julian closed his eyes and leaned back in his chair. There was only one person who could help him make a decision. Someone he had never talked to about it, but who deep down was still present in his life. His wife. Julian went into his room and opened a drawer in his desk. Under the old documents, there was a small box. Inside is a photograph. His wife smiles as she holds Leonardo in her arms when he was a baby. Julian sat down on the bed and looked at her in silence. "I don't know what to do," he whispered. The weight of the absence filled the room. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to talk to her in his mind. "If you were here, what would you tell me?" The answer came immediately, not in words, but in a memory that he had completely forgotten. 7 years ago. "You can't protect him from everything, Julian." "Why not?" "He's my son." "Because he has to learn to fall on his own." Julian watched his wife, who was smiling as she watched Leonardo take his first steps. "If we don't let him try, he'll never learn to walk." Julian frowned. "What if he gets hurt?" She looked at him fondly. "Then we'll be here to raise it." The memory struck Julian like lightning. He knew what he had to do. It was not a matter of victory or defeat. It was a matter of letting my son try, letting him go on his own. And if it falls, it'll be there to pick it up. Julian was looking for Leonardo in his room. The boy was sitting on the bed with a phone in his hand. He seemed nervous, as if he was waiting for an answer that still hadn't arrived. Julian leaned against the door frame. "Son?" Leonardo quickly looked up. "Yes?" Julian took a deep breath and then uttered words that his son had never expected to hear. "Participate in the competition." Leonardo blinked. "Really?" Julian nodded. "Yes. If that's what you really want, do it." For a moment, Leonardo was speechless, and then, unable to restrain himself, he jumped out of bed and hugged his father. Julian froze in place. He didn't remember the last time his son had hugged him like this, and at that moment, he knew he had made the right decision. Later that evening, Julian went down to the kitchen. Isabella was putting away the dishes. When she saw him coming in, she said, "Signor Lombardi." Julian stopped in the doorway and looked at her. "We will prepare him for the competition." Isabella blinked in surprise and then smiled genuinely for the first time in a long time, because she knew that this was not only an opportunity for Leonardo, but also a chance for Julian to become the father he had always wanted to be. The alarm clock rang early in the morning, earlier than usual. Julian turned in bed, looking up at the ceiling. He knew that today would be different. Today, his son had started training for the competition, and this time he wouldn't be watching from afar. This time he will be there. Julian got up and dressed in comfortable clothes. Something had changed in him. For the first time, he didn't feel like he was losing his son. He felt that perhaps he would really recognize him. When he went downstairs, the sound of laughter surprised him. The kitchen, which used to be a place of routine and formality, now seemed to be something else. Leonardo sat behind the central island, devouring his breakfast with energy. Isabella was standing next to him, checking something on her phone. "Ready for a workout?" she asked. Leonardo nodded excitedly. More than ready. Julian went to the coffee maker and poured himself a cup. What time do you start? Leonardo looked at him in surprise. Do you want to see? Julian drank his coffee. I'll be at every training session. Isabella looked up with interest. Does that mean you're going to support us throughout the process? Julian exhaled slowly. That means I'm not going to stand aside. Leonardo smiled enthusiastically. Isabella, for her part, seemed to analyze every word, as if trying to understand how much the millionaire had really changed. The training began in the mansion's dance hall. It was a huge room with mirrors on the walls and a wooden floor, one of the many extravagances that Julian had ordered to be built in his home, but which he almost never used. Today, for the first time, she had a real goal. Leonardo stood in front of the mirrors, stretching his arms. Isabella stood beside him. Let's start with endurance. Leonardo nodded decisively. Julian watched in silence. For the first time, he saw his son in his element, focused, motivated, happy. And in his mind, he couldn't help but make a comparison. When he took him to piano lessons years ago, Leonardo never had that attitude. He had never looked so alive as he did now. Julian crossed his arms over his chest. He had been trying for years to mold his son into something he wasn't, and now he saw the truth clearly. All he had to do was support him. The training progressed intensively. Leonardo practiced turns, jumps, poses, but not everything was easy. There were mistakes, there were falls, there was frustration. At one point, Leonardo tried to make a difficult turn and stumbled, falling to the floor with force. Julian instinctively took a step towards him, but Isabella preceded him. Don't help him, she whispered. Julian frowned. Why? He must rise on his own. Julian stopped. Leonardo remained on the floor for a moment, then stood up with an effort. His breathing was heavy, his hands trembling, but there was determination in his eyes. I'll do it again, he said. And at that moment, Julian realized something important. His son was stronger than he thought. He didn't need to protect him, he only needed to support him. After another hour of training, Isabella paused. Leonardo fell to the floor, exhausted but happy. Julian approached and handed him a bottle of water. Good job, son. Leonardo smiled and took it. Thank you, Dad. Isabella watched the scene with a slight smile. Julian noticed this. What? She shook her head. Nothing. Just glad to see that you finally see him. Julian was silent for a moment, but deep down he knew that she was right. He had never really seen his son before, but now he saw him clearly. And for the first time, he felt proud of him, not of what he did, but of who he was. After training, Julian went to his office to look through some documents. But his thoughts were still in the dance hall, about Leonardo, about his progress, and about a question he couldn't ignore: was he willing to let him compete? He knew that his son was talented, he knew he had potential, but he also knew what the world was like. He knew that sooner or later he would face rejection. And Julian's fear was not that his son would fail, but that he would not be able to cope with it. Later that day, Julian decided to talk to Isabella. He found her in the kitchen, preparing some ingredients. I have something to ask you, he said. Isabella looked at him curiously. I'm listening. Julian crossed his arms over his chest. If Leonardo doesn't win, how will he handle it? Isabella stared at him. Are you afraid that he is not strong enough to withstand this? Julian nodded slowly. I don't want him to be disappointed enough to give up everything. Isabella put her hands on the table and sighed. Signor Lombardi, Leonardo has already suffered the greatest loss of his life. Julian tensed. She continued to speak. Losing a competition is not like losing your mother. Julian closed his eyes for a moment. He couldn't deny it. His son has already experienced the most severe pain. Maybe he was stronger than he thought. After dinner, Leonardo sat down in the living room with his father. Julian looked at him carefully. "How do you feel with training?" Leonardo smiled. "Tired, but happy." Julian exhaled calmly. "Then go on." Leonardo was surprised. "Do you really believe in me?" Julian ruffled his hair. "Always." Leonardo smiled. For the first time, Julian felt that he was where he needed to be and that no matter what happened, his son would be fine. The sky was still dark, only a faint glow announcing the arrival of day. Julian woke up before his alarm clock rang. He no longer needed the insistent sound of the alarm clock to make him get out of bed. This time, something inside him kept him in a state of readiness. He knew that every passing day brought Leonardo closer to the competition. And although he tried to remain calm, fear still gnawed at him from the inside. What if his son isn't ready? What if it's not good enough? But more importantly, what if he lost all the confidence he had gained? Julian rubbed his face with both hands. He had no answers, but today, more than ever, he needed to be by his side. The dance hall was cold and quiet. Leonardo was already there when Julian arrived. He was standing in the center of the hall, stretching. His face expressed determination. He was no longer the boy who hid behind his father's back. He looked like a real dancer now. Isabella stood beside him, watching him with her arms crossed. "Today we will increase the intensity," she said firmly. Leonardo nodded without hesitation. Julian crossed his arms over his chest. "What exactly does that mean?" Isabella looked sideways at him. "This means that he will work at the limit of his capabilities." Julian gritted his teeth. He didn't like the idea that his son would strain too much, but he couldn't stop him. Leonardo had a dream and now he was determined to support it. Leonardo began to train without rest, jumps, turns, complex movements that require strength, precision, and absolute control over the body. Julian watched in silence. Isabella constantly corrected him. If a step wasn't perfect, they repeated it over and over again. Leonardo frowned, exhausted. "But I've already done it 5 times." Isabella looked at him expressionlessly. "Then do 6. The boy bit his lip and looked at his father. Julian remained motionless. He knew that Leonardo was waiting for him to intervene, to say that he had enough. But he didn't, because he knew his son could handle it, and that he needed to learn to endure it in order to succeed. Leonardo exhaled forcefully and tried again. The training was getting harder. Every time Leonardo made a mistake, the disappointment on his face was obvious. And then it happened, an unfortunate turn, a stumble. Leonardo fell sharply to the floor. Julian immediately stood up. But before he could approach, Isabella stopped him with her hand. "Leave him. He's on the floor, and he has to learn to get up on his own." Leonardo sat frowning. "I can't do it," he whispered. Julian felt a lump in his stomach, but Isabella showed no compassion. "Get up." Leonardo shook his head. "I can't." "You can," she insisted. "But if you decide to stay on the floor, the competition will crush you." Leonardo clenched his fists. Julian watched the scene with tension. He wanted to tell his son that he could rest, that he didn't need to continue if he was tired. But then something unexpected happened. Leonardo closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and stood up himself. His determination was stronger than his fatigue. And at that moment, Julian realized something important: his son was no longer a child, he was a fighter. After training, Julian approached Isabella. "Don't you think you put too much pressure on him?" She looked at him calmly. "No more than he could handle." Julian exhaled in disappointment. "But what if he gets hurt?" "If he hurts himself, he will learn from it." Julian looked at her intently. "You're cruel to him." Isabella smiled ironically. "Because I respect him and I respect his dream." Julian frowned. "What does this mean?" That means I don't treat him as a fragile child who needs to be saved. Julian fell silent because he knew she was right. He had tried to protect Leonardo all his life, but now he realized that sometimes the greatest act of love was to let him fight his own battles. That evening, Leonardo received a message on his phone. When he read it, his face changed completely. Julian, who was sitting next to him, noticed the tension in his expression. "What's wrong?" Leonardo did not answer immediately. Finally, he looked up. "One of the dancers who will compete says I don't stand a chance." Julian tensed. "Who is this?" Leonardo showed him the screen. A boy of his age with an arrogant smile on his profile picture. "His name is Santiago," Leonardo muttered. "He says he's won 2 years in a row." Julian frowned. He knew how it worked. He knew that when someone sees a threat, he tries to weaken it before the competition. But his son could not fall for this trick. "Do you know what I think?" said Julian. Leonardo shook his head. Julian smiled slightly. "If he's afraid of you, then he knows you can beat him." Leonardo's eyes lit up, and at that moment Julian realized that he had just done something important. He had managed to give him confidence. That night, in his room, Julian thought about everything that had happened, about his son, about his evolution, about the fact that, without realizing it, he was also changing with him. He looked out the window, seeing the moon illuminating the garden, and for the first time he felt that everything was in its place. Leonardo was ready, and now the real question was, is he ready? The sun had not yet fully risen when Julian's alarm clock rang insistently. He got out of bed faster than usual, feeling the adrenaline running through his body. Today was that day. Today, his son will be dancing in his first competition. As he put on his shirt and dark pants, his thoughts did not stop working. He thought about Leonardo, about his progress, about how he went from a shy and insecure boy to a disciplined and determined dancer. But most of all, he thought about fear. About his son's fear of failing, about his fear of seeing him fall. Julian looked at himself in the mirror and took a deep breath. Today was Leonardo's day, and he would do whatever it took to be by his side. When he went down to the kitchen, he found Leonardo already dressed in his competition suit, tight-fitting black pants, a white sleeveless tank top, and his hair neatly styled. His son looked different, more mature, stronger. But when he looked at him more closely, he saw the nervousness in his eyes. "How do you feel?" asked Julian, pouring himself a cup of coffee. Leonardo paused. "I don't know." Julian raised an eyebrow. "Don't you know?" The boy played with his fingers on the table. "I feel like I've trained a lot. But what if I freeze on the stage?" Julian walked over and put his hands on the table. "This will not happen." Leonardo looked up. "How do you know?" Julian smiled slightly. "Because fear only lasts a second. If you face it, it disappears." Leonardo frowned thoughtfully. "What if he doesn't disappear?" Julian shrugged his shoulders. "Then you dance with fear." "But you're dancing." The boy smiled faintly. "Have you ever done something with fear?" Julian fell silent. He thought about his life, about the difficult decisions, about the business he started without knowing if it would work out, and above all, about being a father without being ready for it. "Every day," he replied at last. Leonardo stared at him, and at that moment he realized something important: fear never goes away completely, we just learn to live with it. The trip to the theater seemed endless. Leonardo sat in the back seat with headphones in his ears. Isabella sat in the passenger seat, checking the details of the event on her phone. And Julian? Julian just drove silently. City traffic seemed more chaotic than usual. Or maybe it was his own anxiety that made him feel this way. He looked in Leonardo's rearview mirror, closed his eyes for a moment, breathing deeply. He looked tense, but he never once asked to go home, didn't say he couldn't do it, and that was what Julian was most proud of. When they arrived at the theater, the place was full of people. Dancers of different ages prepared in the hallways, some practiced their movements, others did breathing exercises, and some just walked back and forth, trying to calm their nerves. Leonardo froze at the entrance, watching everything. "It's real," he whispered. Julian patted him on the back. "It's always been real, son." Leonardo nodded slowly. Isabella walked over and handed him a bottle of water. "You've got 30 minutes before you go on stage." Leonardo took some water and drank a little. "Can I warm up here?" Isabella nodded. "Sure, just focus on yourself." Leonardo moved a few meters away and began to stretch. But then the voice interrupted the moment. "I didn't know that newcomers were accepted for this competition." Julian immediately looked up. In front of Leonardo stood a boy with an arrogant look. It was Santiago, the same one who had sent him a threatening message a few days earlier. Leonardo's jaw tightened. "I'm not a beginner." Santiago smiled mockingly. "Yes? And how many competitions have you won?" Leonardo did not answer. Julian took a step forward, but Isabella touched his arm. "Leave him." Julian tensed. "But Leonardo has to handle it himself." Julian looked at his son and saw him clenching his fists, but not giving in. Leonardo took a deep breath and spoke calmly. "I didn't win any." Santiago laughed mockingly. "Then you don't stand a chance." Leonardo looked at him intently. "Do you know what I think?" Santiago raised an eyebrow. "What?" Leonardo smiled confidently. "If you were really that good, you wouldn't waste your time talking to me." Santiago's face changed completely. For the first time he did not know what to answer. Julian felt proud. His son didn't need anyone to protect him. He defended himself. And it was worth more than any trophy. The judges took their seats, the audience filled the hall, and Leonardo waited backstage with a beating heart. Julian walked over and put his hand on his shoulder. "No matter what happens there, I'm proud of you." Leonardo looked at him in surprise. "Even if I lose?" Julian smiled. "Especially if you lose. Because you had the courage to try." Leonardo's eyes were filled with emotion. It was the first time his father had actually seen him. "Thank you, Dad." Julian nodded, and then the host's voice sounded through the speakers. "Let's welcome Leonardo Lombardi." The lights on the stage were lit, the curtain opened, and Leonardo took his first step towards his fate. There was complete silence in the theater, only the slight whisper of the audience and the creaking of the stage boards under Leonardo's feet. He stood in the center with his back straight, feeling every beat of his heart reverberate in his chest. The lights illuminated him, making him feel open, vulnerable. In the front row, Julian watched him with his arms crossed. His expression was stoic, but his eyes shone with pride. Isabella stood beside him, holding her breath. And at the back of Santiago's hall, the boy who had tried to intimidate him was looking at him with a mocking smile. But Leonardo wasn't going to let that affect him. The leader gave a signal. "When you're ready, you can begin." Leonardo closed his eyes for a moment, took a deep breath, and then the music began. The sound of the piano filled the theater, marking the beginning of his performance. Leonardo slowly raised his hands, letting the music guide him. He knew that everything depended on this moment. He's been training for weeks, falling, getting up, and now it's time to prove it. The first step was soft, controlled, an elegant turn, a precise jump. But then fear struck him. For a moment, everything became blurry, the lights, the audience, the music. His breathing became heavier, his mind began to fill with doubt. What if he failed? What if everyone saw him fall? What if he disappoints his father? Panic threatened to paralyze him, and then he looked in the front row. His father was there. Julian looked at him not with anxiety, not with fear, but with something he had never seen in him before, pride. It didn't matter if he won or lost, his father was already proud of him. Leonardo took a deep breath, and at that moment, the fear disappeared. Leonardo closed his eyes for a moment. He forgot about the audience, forgot about the judges, forgot about Santiago and just danced. His movements became smooth and natural. Every turn, every jump, every stretch of the arms conveyed emotion. The music wasn't just a background sound, it was a story he was telling with his body. And for the first time in his life, he felt completely free. The most difficult moment came, the final turn, one of the most difficult steps he had practiced with Isabella. If he performs it well, he will be able to end his performance strongly. If he fails, all efforts will be in vain. Leonardo remembered Isabella's words, "Don't think, just feel." So he did it. He took a run, turned, and at that moment time seemed to stop. The air enveloped him, the theater disappeared, and when he landed softly, he felt an energy he had never felt before. He did it. The music ended. Leonardo retained the last pose for a moment, breathing rapidly. Silence filled the hall. A second, 2, 3. And then the applause exploded. At first timid, then louder and louder, until the whole theater got on its feet. Julian applauded along with the rest of the audience, but his emotions were different. It was not just pride, it was a revelation. He had just seen his son become something more. He was no longer the fragile child he was trying to protect. He was a young man who had found his passion. And for the first time, Julian felt that his role as a father was not to tell him what to do, but simply to be there. Leonardo entered the dressing room, still breathing rapidly. Isabella waited for him with a proud smile. "Did you feel it?" she asked. Leonardo nodded with a broad smile. "Yes." Isabella ruffled his hair. "This is a real dance. Not a technique, not a competition, but just a feeling." Leonardo turned and saw his father enter. For a moment, he didn't know what to say. Julian walked over and put his hand on his shoulder. "I don't know what the judges will say." Leonardo nodded nervously. "Me too." Julian smiled. "But I don't care." Leonardo looked at him in surprise. "No?" Julian shook his head. "No, because today I saw something I've never seen in you before." Leonardo waited. Julian took a deep breath. "I saw my son do what he loves." The boy was speechless, and then, without hesitation, hugged his father. Julian hugged him tightly. For the first time, he felt like a real father. "Not because I defended him, not because I gave him everything, but because I learned to be next to him." All participants returned to the stage. The judges were preparing to announce the results. Leonardo stood among the others with sweaty hands. Julian looked at him from the hall. Isabella waited in silence. And then the chief referee took the microphone. "And the winner of this year's youth competition is..." A second of silence. Leonardo closed his eyes, waited. And then they called the name. The theater held its breath. Leonardo kept his eyes downcast, feeling the sweat accumulating on his palms. Julian in the front row clenched his fists, unaware of it. He was a man accustomed to business, contracts, investments, but he had never felt as anxious as he does now. The judges held the papers in front of them with neutral expressions. "After discussion, we decided that the winner of this competition is..." A heavy silence descended on the hall. Julian looked at his son. Leonardo closed his eyes. And then the judge pronounced the name. Santiago Beltran. Applause filled the theater. Santiago, the same boy who had tried to intimidate him, raised his hands with an arrogant smile. Leonardo blinked several times, comprehending the news. He did not win. All the preparation, all the sacrifices, and that wasn't enough. For a moment, his mind went blank, his hands trembled slightly, but he didn't cry, didn't move, just kept his composure. Julian watched him with a clenched heart. He was afraid of this moment, and now that it had happened, he didn't know what to do. The referee took the microphone again. "However, we also want to give a special mention to another participant. Leonardo looked up. The audience fell silent again. This dancer, despite being new to competition, has shown a connection to music and a passion that we rarely see in young people his age. Leonardo felt his heart beat faster. For this reason, we want to give an award for the best artistic performance. Leonardo Lombardi. Applause filled the theater again. Leonardo blinked in surprise. The confession wasn't the victory he expected, but it was something. Leonardo walked over to the stage to receive his medal. When the judge put it around his neck, his hands were still cold. He didn't know whether to feel happy or disappointed. He wanted to win, he was preparing for it, but it also meant something. From the audience, Julian looked at his son with a mixture of pride and concern. He knew how he felt, he knew that there was a whirlwind of emotions in his head. But Leonardo did not cry, did not break, just bowed his head as a sign of respect and returned to his seat. After the ceremony, the participants dispersed. Leonardo took off the medal and held it in his hand. It wasn't the trophy he wanted, but it was recognition. Santiago walked over, still holding his own trophy. "Good try," he said with a mocking smile. Leonardo looked at him calmly. He did not answer immediately. "You danced well," he said at last. Santiago raised an eyebrow. "Is that all? Aren't you angry?" Leonardo shrugged. "No. Next time he'll beat you." Santiago was silent for a moment. He hadn't expected such an answer. Then he laughed slightly. "That's what I want to see." Leonardo smiled slightly. "Then get ready." And without saying another word, he turned and walked away. Santiago remained to watch him with a different expression on his face. Not mocking, not arrogant, but with respect. Julian waited for his son to come out of the dressing room. Leonardo appeared, his expression difficult to read. Julian crossed his arms. "How are you feeling?" Leonardo sighed. "I wanted to win." Julian nodded. "I know." Leonardo looked down. "But at least I didn't leave empty-handed." Julian smiled. "No, he didn't." The boy looked at him curiously. "Did I disappoint you?" Julian frowned. "Why do you think so?" "Because I didn't win." Julian put his hand on his shoulder. "Son, victory does not always come immediately." Leonardo blinked. Julian continued, "The important thing is that you didn't give up, that you faced your fear and did it." Leonardo exhaled slowly. "Does this mean that I can continue to compete?" Julian raised an eyebrow. "Did you think I would forbid you to do this?" The boy shrugged his shoulders. "I don't know." Julian smiled. "If that's what you love, then go on." Leonardo's eyes lit up. "Thank you, Dad." Julian nodded, and at that moment, he realized that this was just the beginning. In the car on the way home, Leonardo held his medal between his fingers. It wasn't a trophy for first place, but a symbol of something more important, the beginning of its story. Julian watched him through the rearview mirror. His son has changed. He was no longer an insecure child who hid behind the approval of others. He was now a dancer with determination, and best of all, he still had a lot to prove. Dawn painted the sky with golden and purple tones, slowly illuminating the Lombardi mansion. Julian got up early, as usual, but this time everything felt different. There was something in the air, a sense of change, of growth. He went down to the kitchen and, to his surprise, found Leonardo already awake. The boy's face didn't have the uncertainty he usually wore. No, today he looked confident, determined. He was looking at his medal on the table, not the trophy he wanted, but the recognition he needed. Julian poured himself a cup of coffee and sat down opposite him. "What are you going to do now?" he asked. Leonardo looked up and smiled. "Keep training." Julian frowned slightly. "Aren't you disappointed?" The boy shook his head. "No. Santiago was better than me this time." Julian laughed slightly. It sounds like a challenge. Leonardo shrugged his shoulders, but with a confident smile. Only if he's willing to lose next time. Isabella was a fundamental part of this whole process. She was a coach, a mentor, a person who helped Leonardo find his passion. And now it's time to close this stage. In the kitchen, Julian found her making coffee. "I thought you'd leave later," he said. Isabella smiled slightly. "I don't like long goodbyes." Julian crossed his arms over his chest. "Are you sure you don't want to stay?" Isabella looked at him calmly. "My work here is finished." Julian didn't know what to say for a moment. He knew that without her, none of this would have been possible. And although he wasn't a person who showed emotions easily, this time he decided to do it. "I owe you a lot." Isabella looked at him with a curious expression. "Are you me?" Julian nodded. "Not only did you help my son, you also made me see things I never wanted to see." Isabella sighed with a smile. "It was time for you to see them." Leonardo ran into the kitchen, realizing that Isabella was leaving. "Are you leaving?" he asked with his eyes wide open. Isabella smiled gently. "Yes, the champion. My work here is finished." Leonardo was silent for a moment, then, without thinking twice, he hugged her. "Thank you for everything." Isabella hugged him warmly in return. "Don't stop dancing." Leonardo nodded firmly. "Never." After saying goodbye to Isabella, Julian and Leonardo stayed in the garden. The sun shone brightly, illuminating the vast space where Leonardo trained so often. Julian looked at his son. "What's next?" Leonardo turned with a resolute smile. "Train, improve, and win the next competition." Julian raised an eyebrow. "Is it that simple?" Leonardo shrugged. "Nothing is easy. But if I want to be the best, I have to work for it." Julian watched him silently for a while. His son has grown up. Not in height, not in age, but in thinking. And for the first time, Julian did not feel the need to correct him, to defend him, to tell him what to do. He could only do what a real father should do, support him. The rest of the day passed quietly. For the first time in many years, the Lombardi mansion did not feel like a cold and empty place. Leonardo found his way. Julian learned to be a real father. And although the future was uncertain, for the first time neither of them feared it. Before going to bed, Leonardo stopped in the doorway of his father's study. Julian looked up from the documents and looked at him curiously. "Is something wrong?" Leonardo smiled. "I just wanted to tell you something." Julian put his hands on the table. "What?" Leonardo took a deep breath. "Thank you." Julian frowned slightly. "For what?" Leonardo smiled sincerely. "For not giving up with me." Julian froze for a moment, and then did something he had never done before. He got up, went to his son and hugged him. A real hug, a sincere hug, a hug of father and son. And at that moment, he realized that this story did not end here. It was just the beginning of something even bigger. The beginning of a new life. The beginning of an unbreakable bond. And the beginning of a story that will continue to be written with every step Leonardo takes on the dance floor. This story was not about winning a competition. It was about the bond between father and son, about understanding that success doesn't always come in the form of trophies, but in the bonds we build. Leonardo not only found his passion. Julian not only learned to support his son. Both of them learned what family really means. And this is a real triumph. Please leave your impressions and opinions in the comments. I would be very happy if you would like it.